Your world shrinks to the two sharp points pressing into the soft flesh beneath your chin and the hollow of your throat. They don't pierce the skin, not yet. They are a promise. A promise of stillness, a promise of silence, a promise that any deviation from absolute, rigid piety will be met with an agony that is as precise as it is profound. This is not the work of a battlefield brute or a back-alley thug. This is the calculated application of pain, delivered by the most educated, the most certain, the most terrifying men of their age. This is the dawn of an idea, an institution born from a terror more profound than any plague, the fear that a single, errant thought could damn all of Christendom. This was the holy mandate of the Inquisition. Its purpose, stated in the hallowed halls of the Church, was not to punish but to save the immortal soul from the spiritual contagion of heresy, a sickness believed to spread through whispers, through doubts, through forbidden questions. It was a divine quarantine, and its doctors were the inquisitors. They saw themselves engaged in a desperate, holy war, not for land or for gold, but for the very soul of civilization. The first tremors of this war began in 1184 with the Episcopal Inquisition, a scattered and localized effort. But the beast truly took form in the 1230s, under the iron will of Pope Gregory IX, who established the Papal Inquisition. This was a centralized, bureaucratic machine of faith, an instrument of immense power accountable only to the Pope himself. And in 1252, that power was given its deadliest weapon. Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, a document whose dry, legalistic Latin sanctioned the unthinkable, the use of torture to extract the truth from a heretic soul. The men who wielded this power were not monsters in the conventional sense. The inquisitor was often a Dominican or Franciscan friar, a man of letters, a doctor of theology. He was a scholar, a lawyer, a judge, and an executioner of the spirit, all in one. His gaze was not one of rage, but of cold, unshakable certainty. In his mind, he was a physician excising a cancer from the body of Christ. The pain he inflicted was not cruelty, it was surgery. The process began not with a violent arrest, but with a quiet, creeping dread. The inquisitor would arrive in a town and issue an edict of grace, a period, typically a month, where heretics could come forward, confess their sins, and receive a light penance. But this grace had a terrifying corollary. It was also a time for the faithful to come forward and denounce their neighbors. A business rival, a spurned lover, a debtor, a family enemy. Any of them could whisper a name into the inquisitor's ear, and the process would begin. Communities turned on themselves, poisoned by suspicion. Every conversation became a risk, every friendship a potential liability. And for those accused who remained defiant, the silence would be imposed. The instrument described, the one making its promise against the flesh, was the furca heretica, the heretic's fork. It was not, in the strictest sense, a tool of interrogation. It was an instrument of penance, a physical sermon. 2 sharp prongs were cupped under the chin, 2 more rested against the sternum, and the device was strapped around the neck. To lower your head meant piercing the chest. To speak, to swallow, even to nod off to sleep, meant driving the prongs deep into the soft tissue of the throat. It forced the accused into a posture of pious contemplation, their gaze forever fixed towards heaven. It was a machine designed to manufacture repentance through exhaustion and agonizing stillness. It was a warning, a prelude to the symphony of pain the Church was now willing to compose in the name of God. This was just the beginning, a quiet horror designed to break an individual's will in the solitude of a cell. But this was merely a prelude. For those who would not be silenced by pain, the Church had another, louder method of correction: public humiliation. In the world of medieval Europe, a world built on the rigid foundations of honor, community, and reputation, there were fates worse than a quick, violent death. To be cast out, to be shamed before your neighbors, to have your name and your family's name blackened for all time. This was a kind of damnation on earth. It was a social death, and the Inquisition had perfected it into a devastating form of punishment. The physical pain of a whip might fade, but the stain of public disgrace was permanent, a wound carried not just by the victim, but by their children and their children's children. At the heart of this ritualized degradation was a simple, coarse garment, the sacco bendito, the blessed sack, which would become infamous under its Spanish name, the Sanbenito. This was no ordinary tunic. It was a walking billboard of sin, a theatrical costume for the damned. For a heretic who had repented, the Sanbenito was a stark yellow tunic, often with a simple red St. Andrew's cross. But for the unrepentant, for those condemned to burn, it was a masterpiece of psychological terror. The yellow cloth was adorned with crudely painted figures of devils, dragons, and the mocking flames of hell, a preview of the fate that awaited the wearer. To be forced into this garment was to be stripped of your identity and reclothed in the uniform of the outcast. The punishment was a performance, and the entire town was the audience. The condemned were forced on public walks of penance, paraded through the very streets where they had lived and worked. They were often barefoot, their feet bloodied by the cobblestones, holding a large candle as a symbol of their misplaced faith. Behind them, a friar might intone their sins, while officials or even hired hands delivered lashes with a whip. The procession was a grotesque inversion of a religious festival. The jeers and spittle of the crowd, the cries of former friends, the silent, horrified stares of family. This was the crucible in which a person's spirit was meant to be broken. It was a spectacle of power, a clear and brutal message to all who watched. This is the price of stepping out of line. The true cruelty of the Sanbenito, however, lay in its permanence. After the sentence was served, whether it was a flogging or a term of imprisonment, the garment itself was hung in the local parish church for all to see. It bore the sinner's name, a perpetual monument to their shame. But the stain was not confined to the church wall. It seeped into the very bloodline of the family. In Spain, under the notoriously thorough Tomás de Torquemada, the descendants of a condemned heretic were legally barred from holding public office, from becoming doctors or lawyers, from wearing fine clothes or riding a horse. They were marked, tainted for generations. This practice was the brutal ancestor to later forms of public shaming, a clear and chilling lineage of social control through orchestrated humiliation. It stands as a powerful refutation of the myth that only the physically violent punishments of the Inquisition were truly brutal. For countless victims, the day they were forced into the yellow tunic was the day their world, and their family's future, truly ended. Humiliation could break the spirit, but the Inquisition needed more. It needed a confession. And to obtain the truth locked within a stubborn soul, the inquisitors were permitted to ask the question. The modern imagination pictures the Inquisition's torture chamber as a place of chaotic, sadistic frenzy. But the reality was far more terrifying. It was a place of cold, bureaucratic procedure. The application of agony was not an act of rage. It was a legal tool, governed by a chillingly detailed set of rules. An inquisitor could not simply torture on a whim. The evidence against the accused had to be substantial. A doctor was required to be present, to monitor the victim's health and ensure they did not die prematurely. A dead heretic could not confess, after all. The torture itself was not, in theological theory, a punishment. It was an interrogation technique, a method for helping the accused to tell the truth. This legalism is the true horror of the system. It was not madness. It was a carefully reasoned, meticulously documented process for breaking a human being. And its primary goal was not just a confession. The ultimate prize was information. The inquisitor needed the names of other heretics. Under duress, a victim became an unwilling weapon, their agony used to expand the Inquisition's reach, to implicate friends, family, and neighbors, perpetuating the cycle of fear and accusation. Among the most common methods for asking the question was the strappado, also known as the pulley. Its mechanics were devastatingly simple. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was slung over a beam or pulley. They were then hoisted into the air, forcing the full weight of their body onto their shoulder joints, which were being twisted into a completely unnatural position. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but the true purpose was dislocation. Often, the inquisitors would suddenly release the rope, letting the victim drop a few feet before jerking them to a halt. The violent stop would rip the shoulders from their sockets with an audible pop, inducing a wave of agony and nausea that few could withstand. Another common method, particularly favored in Spain, was the taca, or the water cure. This was not a physical assault in the same way. It was a direct attack on the primal fear of drowning. The victim was strapped to a ladder or a rack, often with their head lower than their feet. Their mouth was forced open, sometimes with an iron prong, and a linen cloth, the taca, was forced down their throat. Then, slowly and methodically, water was poured onto the cloth. The fabric would become saturated, swelling to block the airway and inducing the sensation of suffocation. The victim would gasp and struggle, swallowing water in a desperate attempt to breathe, feeling their lungs fill. The process could be stopped and started repeatedly, pushing the victim to the brink of death over and over again. The one rule that seemed to offer a sliver of protection was that torture could, in theory, only be applied once per person. But even this was subverted by a cynical legal loophole. If a victim endured a session without confessing, the inquisitors would not record it as a completed torture. Instead, they would merely suspend the session, to be continued at a later date. This allowed them to bring the prisoner back, day after day, week after week, to redislocate their shoulders or simulate their drowning, all under the legal fiction that it was part of the same, single application of the question. What is more terrifying, a monster who acts on impulse, or a system that commits atrocities with rules and paperwork? The question could break the will, but some devices were designed not just to inflict pain, but to deliver a terrible, symbolic message, a sermon written in flesh and bone. While the rack, the pulley, and the water cure were brutally efficient at extracting confessions, the Inquisition's arsenal also included a gallery of more specialized, more symbolic instruments. These were devices engineered not just to cause pain, but to serve as a physical allegory for the crime itself. The punishment was a grotesque sermon, a tangible and terrifying manifestation of the sin that had been committed. It was theology made into a machine of torment, transforming the victim's body into a canvas for a moral lesson. One of the most infamous of these devices is the pear of anguish. Its very name evokes a sense of creeping, internal horror. The instrument was a metal, pear-shaped body composed of several segments, or spoons. When the inquisitor turned a key at the base, these segments would slowly and mechanically expand outwards. Its alleged use was as symbolic as it was horrific. For a blasphemer, it would be forced into the mouth and expanded, shattering the teeth and jaw. For a woman accused of consorting with the devil, it could be used internally, its cold, expanding metal a grotesque parody of sin. However, it is here that we must act as historians, separating documented fact from lurid legend. While the pear of anguish is a staple of horror museums, its widespread use by the Medieval Inquisition is heavily debated by scholars. Many of the most gruesome devices associated with the period were actually popularized in the 16th and 17th centuries as part of Protestant propaganda designed to demonize the Catholic Church. The truth of the Inquisition is horrifying enough without embellishment. Similarly, the iron spider, or breast ripper, is a tool whose historical use is shrouded in doubt, but whose symbolic power is undeniable. This clawed, pincer-like instrument was allegedly heated red-hot and used to tear the flesh from women accused of heresy, adultery, or self-abortion. Whether it was widely used or simply a product of a later, more sensationalist age, it speaks to a deep-seated anxiety about female sin, its design intended to destroy the very symbols of femininity and motherhood. The lesson, for anyone who saw or heard of such a thing, was brutally clear. Yet, not all symbolic punishments were mythical. The knee splitter was a brutally simple and undeniably real device. It consisted of two wooden blocks, lined with sharp iron spikes, placed on either side of the victim's knee. A large screw mechanism would slowly draw the blocks together, driving the spikes deep into the joint. The pain would be immense, but the goal was not just pain, it was permanent mutilation. The spikes would shatter the kneecap and destroy the cartilage, crippling the victim for life. This created a walking warning to the entire community. Unlike the agony of the strappado, which left internal injuries, a shattered knee was a visible, public, and lifelong reminder of the consequences of straying from orthodoxy. It was a punishment that continued to preach its sermon every single day, with every limping step the victim took. This distinction is crucial. Some punishments were for the interrogation room, designed to break the will in secret. Others were for the world outside, designed to break the body in public, creating a permanent tableau of the Church's power. But for the Inquisition, the greatest torments were not always swift and violent. Sometimes, the most brutal punishment was simply the passage of time, in a place where God's light could not reach. In the popular chronicle of the Inquisition's horrors, the focus invariably falls on the fire, the rack, and the blade. But perhaps the most common, and in many ways the most psychologically devastating punishment, is the one most often overlooked: imprisonment. To be condemned to an inquisitorial prison was not like a modern sentence. It was not about rehabilitation or paying a debt to society. It was a sentence of spiritual death, a slow, grinding erasure of the self in the name of penance. For many, a quick death at the stake would have been a mercy compared to the decades of cold, silent misery that awaited them. The most severe form of this punishment was known as the murus strictus, the strict wall. This was, in essence, a sentence of living burial. The condemned was placed in solitary confinement, often in a cell so small they could barely stand or lie down, a stone slit in the wall providing the only air and light. They were frequently kept in chains, fed only bread and water, and left in total isolation to contemplate their sins. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water, the scuttling of rats, or the distant, muffled screams of other prisoners. This was not just confinement. It was a deliberate and systematic assault on the human mind. Modern science has shown the profound effects of long-term solitary confinement and sensory deprivation. The mind begins to fracture. Prisoners experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, a loss of memory, and a complete disintegration of their sense of identity. What the inquisitors saw as a path to repentance was, in reality, a meticulously engineered process for inducing madness. It was the ultimate expression of control, breaking not just the body, but the very consciousness of the heretic. A less severe, though still terrible, sentence was the murus largus, or wide wall. This allowed prisoners more freedom of movement within the prison and, critically, allowed them to communicate with other inmates. While the conditions were still squalid and the future bleak, the simple act of human contact could be the difference between sanity and its complete collapse. But even here, life was a monotonous hell. Years bled into decades, with no hope of release. The sentence was for life. The goal was for the heretic to live out the entirety of their natural existence in a state of enforced misery, a living ghost forgotten by the outside world, their name erased from the book of the living. This was the forgotten punishment of the Inquisition. It was a quiet, slow-motion atrocity, carried out not with fire and steel, but with stone, silence, and time. It poses a deeply uncomfortable question to our modern sensibilities, which so often equate brutality with speed and violence. What is crueler, a minute of burning agony, where the body is consumed by fire, or 50 years of absolute silence and darkness, where the mind is left to consume itself? Whether a prisoner rotted in a cell or confessed under torture, the process had to end. But the Church, in its divine mercy, would not be the one to shed blood. For that, it had a willing partner. At the heart of the Inquisition's legal framework lay a profound and deeply cynical paradox. It was an institution with the power to investigate, to prosecute, to torture, and to condemn, but it lacked one critical authority: the power to kill. An ancient doctrine, Ecclesia abhorret sanguine, the Church abhors blood, forbade any cleric from being responsible for a death sentence. This presented a significant problem. What was to be done with the most obstinate heretics, those who refused to repent, or those who had repented once and then relapsed into their old beliefs? The Church could not execute them, but it could not allow them to live and risk spreading their spiritual poison. The solution was a masterstroke of legal and theological theater, a piece of procedural fiction that allowed the Church to sentence thousands to a fiery death while claiming its hands remained perfectly clean. This process was known as relaxation, or the act of releasing the condemned heretic to the secular arm. After the ecclesiastical trial was complete and the heretic was found guilty and unrepentant, they were formally handed over to the agents of the local king, duke, or city council. At the moment of the transfer, the inquisitor would make a grand, public plea. He would beg the secular authorities to treat the prisoner with mercy, to act with clemency, and, crucially, to avoid the shedding of blood and the danger of death. Everyone present, the inquisitor, the king's men, the crowd, knew this was a charade. They all knew that the secular law in virtually every corner of Europe demanded only one punishment for heresy: death by burning. The plea for mercy was an empty ritual, a way to maintain the Church's veneer of bloodless purity while ensuring its ultimate sentence was carried out. This was not a mere loophole. It was a symbiotic relationship between two powerful forces. The church needed the state's sword to enforce its will, to provide the final, terrifying deterrent. The state, in turn, gained immensely. By positioning itself as the loyal defender of the faith, it solidified its own authority. It also gained a legal pretext to eliminate political dissenters and, not insignificantly, to seize the often vast properties and wealth of the condemned heretics. It was a perfect fusion of spiritual dogma and political pragmatism. For the condemned, the moment of relaxation was the point of no return. It was the final, irrevocable word. Once they were in the hands of the secular arm, there was no more room for appeal, no more chance for repentance. Their fate was sealed. The entire ritual was a grim echo of Pontius Pilate washing his hands of the death of Jesus. The church, like the Roman governor, declared itself innocent of the blood of the condemned, passing the final, violent responsibility to another authority that it knew would act without hesitation. It was a dark, clever, and brutally effective conspiracy of convenience, allowing two powerful institutions to achieve their goals while publicly absolving each other of the grim reality of the act. With the church's hands officially clean, the state was free to carry out the final sentence. And it would not be done in a dark dungeon. It would be a grand, public spectacle, a day of celebration known as the Act of Faith. The culmination of the inquisitorial process was not a somber execution carried out in the dead of night. It was a lavish, state-sponsored production, a terrifying piece of religious theater known by its Portuguese and Spanish name, the Auto de Fe, or Act of Faith. This was not merely about punishment. It was about demonstrating the absolute power and divine justice of the church and state to the entire populace. It was a festival of fear, a combination of solemn procession, public trial, and gruesome entertainment that could last an entire day. The event began with a grand procession through the main streets of the city. It was a meticulously ordered parade of the entire social hierarchy. At the front were local parish officials and guilds, followed by the prisoners, who provided the central, grim spectacle. The reconciled heretics wore their simple yellow Sanbenitos. Those condemned to burn wore the horrifying garments painted with demons and flames, some topped with a tall, conical hat, a grotesque parody of a bishop's mitre. They held unlit candles, their faces a mixture of terror and resignation. Behind them marched the agents of the state and the church in all their finery, secular magistrates, nobles on horseback, and the solemn, black-robed inquisitors themselves, the architects of the entire affair. The procession would wind its way to the city's main square, where a massive stage had been erected. Here, before a crowd that could number in the tens of thousands, the ideological climax of the day would unfold, a long, fiery sermon delivered by a high-ranking inquisitor. For hours, he would preach on the mortal danger of heresy, the righteousness of the holy office, and the divine justice of the sentences about to be pronounced. It was a direct and powerful message of intimidation aimed at every soul in the audience. Following the sermon came the reading of the sentences. This was a moment of immense public drama and suspense. One by one, the prisoners were brought forward as their names and verdicts were read aloud. Some were acquitted, their announcements met with gasps of relief. Others were sentenced to penance, flogging, or long years in prison. And then, finally, came the names of those who were to be relaxed to the secular arm. Imagine a parade, a public holiday. The streets are full, vendors are selling food. And at the center of it all is a group of men and women about to be burned alive. The Auto de Fe was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Its scale, pageantry, and public nature were designed to awe the population into obedience. It was a powerful piece of propaganda that said, "This is our power. This is what happens to those who defy us. You could be next." The fate of the few being condemned was secondary to the lesson being taught to the many. It was a demonstration not of justice, but of absolute, unquestionable authority, and the burning bodies were merely the final, horrifying exclamation point. As dusk fell and the religious ceremonies concluded, the final act began. The condemned were taken to a place outside the city walls, to a place called the Quemadero, the burning place. The choice of fire as the ultimate punishment for heresy was steeped in a deep and terrifying theology. In the medieval mind, fire was a paradoxical element. It was the fire of hell, the ultimate damnation, but it was also a symbol of divine purification. It was believed to be the only force capable of cleansing the profound stain of heretical thought, not just from the individual, but from the community itself. Burning the body also served another, equally horrifying purpose. It denied the heretic a proper Christian burial. In an age of profound faith, the integrity of the body was considered essential for the final resurrection. To be reduced to ash was to be scattered to the winds, to be erased from the physical world, a state that many believed could jeopardize the fate of one's immortal soul. It was the ultimate act of annihilation. Yet, even in this final, brutal moment, a small, grim mercy could be extended. If, at the foot of the stake, a condemned heretic finally broke and repented, confessing their sins and reaffirming their Catholic faith, they would not be spared the fire, but they would be spared the full agony of. As a reward for their last-minute conversion, they would be garroted. An executioner would wrap a cord or an iron collar around their neck and strangle them to death just before the pyre was lit. Their lifeless body would still be consumed by the flames, but they would have been granted the mercy of a quicker, less excruciating death. For those who remained defiant to the end, there was no such mercy. The medical reality of this death is the stuff of nightmares. As the flames licked at the pyre, the first sensation would be the searing of the skin, the nerve endings screaming in protest before being destroyed. The intense heat would boil the fluids within the body, and body fat would act as a fuel, igniting and turning the victim into a human torch. But contrary to popular belief, death was often not from the direct burning of the flesh. More commonly, the true cause of death was asphyxiation. The massive fire consumed all the available oxygen, while the victim inhaled superheated air, smoke, and carbon monoxide, searing the lungs and leading to suffocation. The great philosopher and cosmological theorist Giordano Bruno met this fate in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1600. Accused of numerous heresies, including the belief in an infinite universe with other worlds, he refused to recant. His tongue was pierced with an iron spike to prevent him from uttering any final blasphemies before he was burned alive, becoming a martyr for free thought. From the perspective of the crowd, this was the ultimate deterrent. The sight of a human being writhing in the flames, the horrifying screams, the nauseating smell of burning flesh. This was an image of hell brought to earth, a visceral, unforgettable warning that would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed. The fires eventually died down, leaving only ash. But the fear ignited by the Inquisition would burn for centuries, leaving a permanent scar on the soul of the West. The fires of the Auto de Fe did not burn out overnight. The Holy Office of the Inquisition was not a singular event in the Dark Ages, but a remarkably durable institution that adapted and evolved over centuries. Its power waned not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow, grinding decline, finally being abolished in Spain as late as 1834. Its shadow stretched from the medieval world almost to the dawn of the modern age, and its legacy is far more complex and insidious than just the memory of its torture chambers. While the chains and the racks have turned to rust, the Inquisition's most enduring legacy may be its contribution to the machinery of the modern state. It pioneered and perfected techniques of bureaucratic control that would later be adopted by secular powers. The meticulous record-keeping, where every accusation and every word of testimony was written down, the system of informants and secret surveillance, the use of psychological manipulation alongside physical coercion, all of these were hallmarks of the Inquisition. It created a blueprint for an ideological police state, a system where the most dangerous crime was not what you did, but what you thought. This legacy forces us to look beyond the religious trapping and see the core psychological driver of the institution, the terrifying power of absolute certainty. The inquisitors were not, in their own minds, evil men. They were righteous. They believed so completely in the purity of their cause and the divine truth of their mission that it justified every atrocity. They were doing God's work, and in the service of such an ultimate good, any means became permissible. This unwavering belief that they possessed a monopoly on truth is the central warning of their entire history. The inquisitorial mindset, the obsessive hunt for hidden networks of dissent, the belief in vast, soul-destroying conspiracies, the division of the world into the pure and the tainted, did not die with the Holy Office. It is a pattern of thought that has echoed through history, from the witch hunts of the 17th century to the political purges of the 20th. The search for heretics becomes the search for subversives, traitors, or ideological enemies. The methods change, but the underlying psychology of fear and persecution remains eerily familiar. And so, the story of the Inquisition ends not in the past, but with a deeply unsettling question for the present. The institution itself is gone, a relic of a distant and brutal age. But are the human impulses that created it, the fear of the other, the intoxicating desire for ideological purity, the terrifying ability to justify cruelty in the name of a greater good, truly gone? Or do they simply wear different robes today?